and gentlemen, my name is Marek Sklimowski. I'm the President and Executive Director of the Kosciuszko Foundation. Welcome to book launch towards Xenopolis, Visions from the Borderland, a conversation with the author Krzysztof Czyzewski on lessons we have failed to learn. And let me welcome future speakers. So the author Krzysztof Czyzewski, welcome to New York. Professor Timothy Snyder, Professor Irena Grudzińska-Gross, Professor Jeffrey Goldford, and Professor Elżbieta Matynia. Let me applaud Mr. Czyzewski's work, which is the Borderland Foundation, based in Sejny, northeastern Poland. It's an organization that builds bridges for people of different religions, nationalities, and cultures. I come from a borderland region, like most of those born and raised in present or former Eastern Poland, the region where the Ukrainians were in majority till 1947. There was almost nothing left but hatred to those who once lived there. The hatred that suddenly on February 24th, let's hope, disappeared forever, or just paused. I hope the book, which seems to be even more relevant these days, as well as tonight's conversation, will help us find answers to how diverse communities can relate to each other. Let me introduce Elżbieta Matynia. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for hosting us in this incredible uptown venue, which, you know, we from downtown, we are not really in the places like that. We don't study places like that. Thank you very much, Kosciuszko Foundation. Thank you. Here's the book. Here's the book, and I'm going to read a passage from the book, because I understand you don't have a book yet. I'm looking at you, and I'm so delighted to see so many friends and so many faces that I know. Good evening, everybody. We have destroyed the Berlin Wall, opened borders, adopted the internet, and most of us live in multicultural cities. But the existence of wall is the lived experience of modern Europeans. In view of the rising tide of immigrants, and perhaps primarily of the growing weakness of the center that we were accustomed to regard as exclusively ours, we begin to build walls, fences, and barbed wires along the borders of nation states. At the same time, we are aware that the deepening divisions are less and less a question of the barriers of language, ethnicity, or political systems. Today, walls grow between communities living on the same side of the river and are erected by the sharp and confrontational boundaries of cultural identities. This is the first paragraph of the book. The book is beautifully written and it reads really, really well. This is a strong beginning of the book that just came out published by the Rochester University Press, and this is the first book, not the first book that Krzysztof authored in English, but the very first published in the United States. Towards Xenopolis, Visions from the Borderland. Again, good evening, everybody. My name is Elżbieta Matynia, I know that, but I have to introduce myself just so everything will be in order. I teach at the New School for Social Research. I am a sociologist studying culture and politics, and I'm delighted to be with you tonight. And it is incredibly gratifying to be able to be a part of the book launch, of the first book launch in the United States, and talk about this book, beautifully crafted, as you can see, and if you will open it inside, you will be even more impressed. And it's very gratifying to have the author with us. You know, those days you never know whether people will show up on the screen or in person, and your person is so valuable. We also, as you know, have quite extraordinary group of people, and Marek Sklimowski already introduced the names. You see the names. Extraordinary group of people that will discuss the book and more. There are more detailed bios in the program, so I'm not going to repeat that. But let me just say very briefly a few words about our guests. Of course, you know Krzysztof Czyżewski, and if you don't know Krzysztof Czyzewski, you will have a chance to meet him afterwards, and of course to hear him in the course of the evening. I'd love to introduce him way back. Now everybody introduces him like that, but way back when we were talking about, actually, who are you? Are you an actor, a theater director? Who are you? An activist? He already knew, and I don't know whether that came from his friends or from him, from his American, because we met here in New York. He said, "No, I'm a practitioner of ideas." And that is something. But of course, he's also a writer and philosopher. He's cultural animator of culture. He's indeed theater director. He's an editor. He is co-founder and president of the Borderland Foundation. And if you never went to this part of Poland, which is very much in the north, in Suwalszczyzna, in the small shtetl, former shtetl, Sejny, there is the center that he directs, the Center of Arts, Cultures and Nations. It's worth it to go there. They have beautiful lakes also, and they are incredibly beautiful people to see there. Let me go alphabetically around the table. Jeffrey C. Goldberg, my oldest American friend, is Michael E. Gellert, Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the New School for Social Research. He studied in Poland, that's how we met, I have to say that. And he studied student theater, and he studied this kind of growing uneasiness and loneliness in Poland. He was there in mid-70s, and then he studied Solidarność, and inspired by Polish dissidents, he organized one of the most extraordinary small projects, tiny projects, which brought New York, Warsaw, Budapest, and to a certain extent Prague together, a small clandestine democracy in the seminar. It was called Democracy. Now it was clandestine in Poland and in Budapest, and here we met downtown, of course. He wrote books somewhere in Poland, and perhaps somewhere, I think, inspired by the lessons he learned from Poland. He received the Solidarity Medal of Solidarity, given to him by Lech Wałęsa. He is the founder of the public seminar, and he now runs another edition of Democracy Seminar. We need to think and to talk about democracy, and this is what he does. Irena Grudzińska-Gross, our 68ers, as I sometimes think. We have 68ers. Irena is a member of the 1968 diaspora immigration, once a student at Warsaw University, who defended her doctoral dissertation at Columbia University, and then taught literature and history at Emory, Boston University, Princeton. She is currently, so to speak, back home, a professor of literature at the Polish Academy of Science. Of course, she lives here. Her books are about people and ideas, people caught up in unusual, often unexpected circumstances, starting with Tocqueville and Kustin, Miłosz and Brodsky, and now she works on something, and there are some other books, but I'm not going to mention it, on Alexander Weisberg. In case somebody knew him, go to her when we have this glass of wine downstairs. Alexander Weisberg-Cybulski, this is the book that she works on currently. Timothy Snyder is the Richard C. Levin Professor of History at Yale University. In case you didn't really read the bios, he speaks 5 languages and reads 10 languages, European languages. He, I think this is not in the bio, lives in Poland in the summer, for several summers already, and part of the year he spends in Vienna, where he is a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences. And yes, you do know him from the TV screen too. I remember when I met him first, he doesn't remember that, we never talked about it. But it was with Krzysz. Krzysz came with his book, with Tim's book, in Polish, and I think it was the book which in English came as the Reconstruction of Nations. Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, 1569, 1999. I think that we have to go to see this book and to reread this book again. Now, very briefly about Krzysztof. It's kind of difficult to talk about the person who is sitting right there, and I'm not going to talk about his bio at the moment, but he is a unique thinker, and whose voice provides this startlingly fresh perspective on things that we deal with, current problems, well, debates both in academia and in policy circles and in artistic circles, and all of that is about daunting divisiveness in today's world. And he started to think about it a long time ago. Though not directly associated with any academic institution, his work has been really influencing very many scholarly works and discussions for some time already, including the renewed discussion on the importance for social sciences, for example, of exploring non-traditional sources of for research and non-traditional and to think about non-traditional research methods. You know, academia also needs to be shaken up. So he does that. For someone like me, and Czyzewski's work, his social and his cultural practices, his essays and his public talks, and he's been a source of continuous inspiration. Wanting to introduce to his idea my colleagues and my and students, I have often invited him to give the talks at the New School, but also to teach or co-teach or to give a guest talk sometimes at the annual institute that we had first in Krakow and then in Wrocław, called Democracy and Diversity. And then the question always was, okay, and when can I read him? Well, indeed it wasn't so easy, but now we have a book. We have a book, and we are very thankful for that. So those things were very special encounters. Encounters with Krzysztof are always special, prompting very many listeners to travel long distances to Sejmie and to Krasnogróda to become acquainted with his work and his colleagues in Krasnogróda more directly. However, 4 years ago, I think, it was in the discussion which followed the lecture that we conducted with Jeff, a university lecture called Women and Men in Dark Times, a familiar old question was brought again. And so where is this book that you told us is going to come up? Well, here it is. And indeed, in times like of crisis like ours, which are marked by the mountain resentments and between groups, whether living next to each other or oceans apart, that new approach is very urgently needed. And so we have a book. We have a book, and it's unusual. I have my first question, and I'm going to skip whatever I wanted to say because I think it's just much too much. And I wanted to ask Krzysztof a question. There's a wonderful line in the book. It's actually a dedication. At the same time, an eye-opener. And you write here, to the people of Borderland, to the people of the Borderland, who in song and in the conversation taught me to hear the voice of the third. Could you, I'm not asking you to explain what you want to say, I think we all know, but could you perhaps tell us how this book came about? Up to you, whatever. You can sit, you can come. You good when you.
Yeah, it's hard to see.
Sure.
Thank you, Elżbieta. Thank you, Kosciuszko Foundation, for the hospitality. It's a big honor and happiness for me to be be among you, among my teachers, my friends, partners in work. And New York is a special city for me. The New York community, because the book and all my work is about the borderland. And you see very often this name we have, which sounds in Polish Pogranicze, was misleadingly translated as a Borderland Foundation. And to explain why it is not a borderline but a borderland helps me very much to be with you here in New York, and to that community, that traditions, that milieu, way of understanding of culture as sharing something in common rather than to focus on divisions and differences, which is not typical for Europe, especially for Central Eastern Europe. We are proud to be very diversified, and we are proud of our richness of differences. But my work with my team was, of course, from one side to rediscovering differences which were erased during Soviet time, of course. It was, as we called in Soviet camp, uravnilovka. So everything is the same. There is a Homo Sovieticus space we all belong to. So to show, to design, or to rediscover the difference was quite important thing. It was how we started this way toward the borderland, through the rediscovering differences, respecting them, giving them voice, memories, justice, and so on. But this was, and if we think about the center we established in 1990-91 in a small town of Sejny, that was the first thing, to have people coming into this center and becoming more as they are, more Lithuanians, more rational believers, more Roma gypsies, more Ukrainians deported to our region with the Vistula action, in 1947. So that was the first act of being the borderlander. Become what you are. Be more in your language, in your difference, identity, culture, ethnicity, and so on. But that was not the end of the story. That was just the beginning. And there was much more to be developed, and which we started to find new words for that, like connective tissue, which this phrase came from Czesław Miłosz, from our first meeting with him, when he was asking us, what you are going to do in this small town? You are avant-garde theater people coming, in 1989, 90 to a small town, except of going to the west, to the festivals and so on. What are you going to do? And we didn't have a language to explain it. We grew up on the books. I would call them książki zbójeckie, dangerous books, like Mickiewicz was saying, about books which are changing your life, so having this strong impact on your life. So we knew Borderland from the books, in fact, published mostly in opposition, underground press in the 70s and 80s. But thanks to that, we knew this concept of the borderland, człowiek pogranicza, the borderlander, which sounded very strangely. And then when I was traveling along eastern border of Poland, when I was asking about, here's probably a Jewish cemetery, is there anybody who can tell me a little bit about that? Or Probably there's a Greek Catholic Church or some other traces, you know, of the others. People were saying, go to her or go to him. She's a borderlander, she will tell you. And I was always curious, who is this borderlander in fact? And once I've heard this phrase on the Bug River, you know, there were two old men explaining me who is a borderlander. When two persons meet to sing, the song goes on three voices. And this third voice is something to the heart of the borderland. It's not a dialogue between two. This is not a dialogue between two sides. If you have only that, you are not yet borderlander. Only when you will hear the third voice, not belonging to any concrete side, any concrete identity, any concrete individual, unpossessed, in between, then you hear the borderland. Only at that moment. So it's something more than two sides. You know, the bridge builder should know the third voice to be a good bridge builder, not only two sides of the river in his craft. And more I was working in the borderland, more I was convinced that there is a very, very important message in that phrase I've heard for the first time at that moment. And if you ask me, Elżbieta, about the book in short, as I told you about this phrase connective tissue, the same is with Xenopolis. In the title is a new word created by me, although you can know it as a Xenopolis, you know, city of the strangers. Yeah, but in fact, it is a translation into more universal language of a very special word we have in Polish, obcowanie, which means living together, creating community, but in the heart of this word is a stranger. So obcy in Polish is a stranger. Obcowanie means living together or creating community. You may say it's a paradoxical thing, but this is how I translated it. You know, there is a polis, yes, the small community, the unit of democracy, of people living together, but at the heart of it is a xenos, you know, the Greek stranger, the host, and in fact, there is no polis. It's not about the hospitality of the polis. It's about this way of understanding it, that there is no community, there is no polis without a stranger, without the other. And the way how I read it, you know, it's also in the architecture, in Polish traditional architecture, when you have a house, which you may connect with oikos, with this Greek space for living, being rooted in the space. In this traditional building, there were big family, you know, many children, sometimes very tight space for living, sometimes, you know, few children sleeping in one bed, but always in that house was something what they called empty room, czysta izba, the unpossessed space in the house. And the understanding of that was that there is no real house without this empty space, which is unpossessed by the owners of the house, ready for host, ready for something what comes from outside, but belonging to the deep feeling of what the house is. And this is another lesson for my practice to create cosmopolis, to be on the way that okay, coming back to these differences, you should respect them, you should give them voice, you should understand that that you always will live with diversity around you, with polyphony, pluralism. That's one thing. Another thing is this connective tissue, which connects, which is like a living power of your organism, of your body. But without connective tissue, the organism is dying. But there is a third level of that you should withdraw yourself with possessing around yourself. You should focus also on creating empty space, unpossessed, czysta izba, empty room, to have a Xenopolis. Because otherwise, this common living would be impossible. So that's how this book is created, on these several levels of my reflection of practicing Borderland, and giving and respecting the differences, giving the voice to the others, trying to develop this concept of connective tissue in practice, but at the same time thinking about giving up your rights, because empty room is very much about giving up your rights. We have rights. We feel that there are very important things, but the life on the borderland is not about defending your rights only. Sometimes about giving up rights to have an empty space for something new you don't know about, or you can't predict, or and that makes the possibility of creating something in common. So, in short, thank you.
So let's turn to the readers of the book. And the first one, Timothy Snyder, because he wrote a foreword to the book. It's a beautiful piece, and it really conveys the dimension of Krzysztof's work that you just were introduced to, which is very often guided by the poetry of Miłosz. A writer who also lived under different various political systems, spoke various languages, and was born a borderlander, right? So, as you may know, you don't know that. You may not know that, but there is a poem. There is a poem that Timothy Snyder uses at the very beginning. Miłosz's poem. He refers to it at the very beginning when he says, it is one verse of the poem. Most of all, sir, I miss the porcelain. I will go back to that poem later on, or actually to this verse later on, but I'd like to turn to Timothy Snyder so we can hear him and his reflections.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Elżbieta. It reminds me that the last time I saw Krzysztof Czyzewski and was in Krasnogruda, I was reciting that very poem. That very characteristic poem by Miłosz, which adorns the cafe in the cellar of the house in Krasnogruda, which used to be the pension, which was owned by Miłosz's family on his mother's side. And that house now restored and beautifully painted red, is now part of the Pogranicze Foundation's work. It's a center for dialogue, a kind of anti-museum, where you enter not to find statues of Miłosz and and notes about the great about the greatness of Polish poets. I'm thinking of Ferdydurka if I say that, but rather modest citations and gentle guidance through the world of thought and letters of Czesław Miłosz. And in that house, you also find a kind of invitation to be outside, and living in that house as we do in the summers. I notice that people come to the house very often when it's closed and just wander about the lake country. And so the house itself is a kind of example of this liminality, right? This sort of this invitation, this empty space that Krzysztof is speaking about. Now, the poem that Elżbieta was kind enough to mention is about war. It's when the poet says, most of all I miss the porcelain, he's reminiscing about what it's like before the war came to be sitting by a riverside, taking tea, bringing sweets, bringing tea, sitting on the bank of a river, having a picnic. The same bank where which will then be crushed, rendered ugly by the treads of a tank. That's not the rhyme in Polish, but that actually does rhyme in Polish. And the mode of the poem is a mode of nostalgia, but a nostalgia for something concrete, a nostalgia which insists on something very specific, like what the porcelain actually looks like. So when the poet says, most of all I miss the porcelain, he's not making a grand claim about how wonderful Poland was in the interwar period before those Soviet and German tanks came. He's insisting on something very particular, that somewhere there was a world in the 1930s where people were drinking out of specific porcelain with a specific pattern, and that specific pattern still exists somewhere. Now, in the case of Krasna Ruda and this house, the porcelain was buried to save it from the war, as many valuable things were in Poland. Unlike most valuable things that were buried during the war in Poland, this one was actually rediscovered in a happy circumstance, so that the very same porcelain which existed before the war in this pension owned by Miłosz's family now exists again and now can be used again, which is a kind of a small story of rediscovery, right? Because what the Borderland Foundation is not about the grand narrative. It's not about large-scale myths or demolishing large-scale myths. It's much more about the particular and how the particular can invite one into conversation, right? How the particular can be the thing that we share and that surprises us, whereas the general, the big narrative, might be the thing that divides us. And so I see this emphasis on the particular as a theme which runs through this book, and also a theme which runs through the work of Krzysztof and his family and his team in Krasna Ruda and in Sejny. And I want to focus on the particular as something which is surprising, right? So you're probably surprised that I started talking about porcelain. I was a little surprised myself that I started talking about porcelain. The particular has a way of being surprising, whereas the general is very rarely surprising. The general you've always heard before in one form or another. So in these essays, Krzysztof is taking several particular themes and going with them in unexpected directions. In their totality, what you have, at least as I read him, you have a kind of Polishness which used to be more familiar than it is now. A Polishness which in the 1920s and 1930s, in figures like, well, precisely the young Miłosz, but also Stanisław Stępowski, or even Jerzy Giedroyc, a Polishness which is comfortable in a wider world of Western civilizational and ancient references, but which is somehow nevertheless deep, thickly embedded in the tangle of the eastern borderlands of Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, the Jewish world that once inhabited those places. If these essays, I mean, if you took some of the contemporary references aside, these are essays which one might have found in the 1920s and 1930s among a certain set of liberal, I will call them cosmopolitan because I'm not sure if we can say Xenopolitan yet. I mean, Xenopolis has just been introduced. Maybe it's too soon for Xenopolitan. But there is very much a current. Maria Dąbrowska, Henryk Czyzewski, these quirky liberals, but quirky liberals who are interested in the groups that they didn't see as national minorities, but in groups that they saw as constitutive of what Polishness actually was, in a kind of mysterious way where the mystery could only be communicated precisely by things like song, precisely by song, poetry, right? And so this is what I wanted to say about the methods. I wanted to say about the methods of Krzysztof's work, because when one asks, where is the book from Czyzewski, there's a certain assumption that, okay, if we could just get this guy contained in a book, then all of the wisdom would come through. And of course, it is a very wise book. But at Pogranicze, I would say that the writing comes second, and the activity comes first. And the method of the activity is to find these particularities, perhaps these surprising particularities, and seize on the particularities as something that might be in common. For example, Lithuanian folk songs, right? So having Polish women, or at least one, learn Lithuanian folk songs, or Yiddish music. So one of the things that Pogranicze does is that it educates the local children who are just as Polish and Lithuanian can be, with the towheads and the bad haircuts, raising them in the Jewish music of the 20s and the 30s of the last century, so that when they reach a certain age and can ask themselves about the land that they're in and who used to live here and why is there a synagogue, those questions will already be asked by a person who is in some way living in that culture, right? So the particular, but then also there's with the particular comes in the work of this book and in the work that they do in Pogranicze, a certain kind of, I would call it, tact, which I certainly lack, and historians in general certainly lack, because our business is to figure out the way that things are. And if that turns out to be painful and difficult, well, so much the worse for the people who are pained. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable way to go about things. I think there's a place for truth tellers in the world and so on. But the way that Pogranicze works, and you can feel that style in these essays, is different. History is surprising, right? History is made up of particularities, and therefore it's surprising. History generally runs against the things you think you know, the things that your parents told you, or the things that you learned in school. Actual history tends to work against that, right? Very few Americans would know, for example, that without engineers, or without a particular engineer from Poland, we might well have lost the Revolutionary War, and things would have been very different. A particularity, right? A particularity, a surprising particularity. But the particularities can be painful. They can be shocking. They can be painful, and people can therefore react against them. And then that can form communities in a negative way. I don't want to hear about your particularities. I don't want to hear about your suffering. You have to hear about my suffering first. And of course, that's a dead end, because then we can just go back and forth for generations or eternally about who suffered more at the hands of whom. But what if there were another way? What if you start by giving people things like music? What if you start by giving people things like the translation of books? What if you start with a gift which is not national and which doesn't represent any community necessarily, but which is nevertheless a gift, a surprise, a song, or a poem? And this is the activity of Pogranicze. These are the things. I'm just saying words now, and these words can only suggest what the activity is like, because the activity is by way of music. it's chiefly by way of music and theater and art. It's not first of all the philosophers and the historians and so on, like getting to talk. I mean, eventually, like, we get to say something at some point, but the first thing that is happening is the activity and the gift and the particular. Now, I just wanted to say one more thing about how I feel that this way of dealing with difference and culture is set in a larger comparison of how we've all dealt with the world after 1989. This world after 1989 that we're still, living in, or in the case of, Ukrainians dying in, how we've processed the diversity, the challenges of the past that emerged after 1989. I'm going to suggest that there are two main ways that we broadly, the West, but also East Europeans, dealt with 1989, which is a question that Jeff Goldfarb has dealt with extensively. Very roughly, one of them was to say it all didn't really matter, right? It didn't really matter because at the end of the day, we're all the same. At the end of the day, we all just want money. At the end of the day, we just want consumer goods, right? At the end of the day, we're all rational people. So all that stuff that you Poles know, or you Ukrainians know, or you Jews know, doesn't matter. We don't really care. We'll nod gravely, but we don't really care because all that really matters is the rationally pursued interests of people, right? And so one way of thinking about the past after 1989 was just to say, forget about it. Just forget, move on, people. Just move on. We're going to tell you that economics is going to drive politics, capitalism is going to bring democracy, everyone's going to turn out to be rational, and it's all going to be fine. Right? So the neoliberal advice about how to deal with politics and economics also comes with a cultural program, which is forget about it. Basically, just forget, and in the next generation, your children will grow up rational. Which, of course, that never happens, the children growing up rational. I speak as a parent. And then on the other side, so there's the neoliberal answer, right? The forget answer. And then on the other side, there is the answer of remembering our way. So to say, no one knows our story. Everyone has forgotten our story. Our story is very important. And of course, there's always a measure of truth in that. Just like there's a measure of truth that we're rational and we like stuff. There's a measure of truth in that. There's a measure of truth when the Ukrainians say no one knows about the Holodomor. There's a measure of truth when Poles say no one knows about Kati. There's a measure of truth when Jews say nobody knows about the Holocaust by bullets in the East. There's a measure of truth always in saying our story is the story that other people don't know. And it's captivating, but the problem with it is that if you just tell it as your story the entire time, then even when people know it, they don't really know it. Like, they'll realize that it's there and that they have to acknowledge it in some way, but they don't feel it, right? You can kind of force it on them, but they don't really feel it. It just becomes like there's a kind of political correctness about it where everyone just kind of, okay, we accept that everyone has the right to one bad story. Maybe if we like you especially, you have the right to two bad stories. But we kind of accept that there's a kind of mathematics to all this. Everybody gets one bad story, and then we kind of ritually accept that everyone has one bad story. And in a way, nothing is learned, right? Nothing is learned. Another way of dealing with 1989 is to insist that our story was very bad and our story is worse than other people's stories, and then to get into competition with other people, right? Poles and Lithuanians, or Poles and Jews, or Poles and Ukrainians. Not only Poles are involved in this sort of thing. Those examples are just familiar ones from my life. And that way of looking at the past, of saying that we have our story and no one knows it, and no one can really know it. Like, that's the other thing. You also kind of insist no one can really know how bad it is, right? That move then becomes a kind of far-right position in politics, because your notion is that the rest of the world will never really get how bad it is to be us. And so, and that's a very determined position, not only in Poland, also in plenty of other countries. It's surprising who can be a victim, right? It's surprising you can be very wealthy and run a very big country, and it still turns out that you're a victim. So that's another way of dealing with the past. this kind of right-wing way of saying we have a very painful story and no one else will ever understand our story. And that's very powerful, not just in Eastern Europe, it's very powerful all around the world, extremely powerful in Russia right now. Arguably the reason why Russia is fighting a war right now. So when I set out these two polls, what I'm trying to say is that the work of the Borderland Foundation, as evidenced in these essays, is something completely different. Right? It's something completely different. It doesn't say we're all rational, and it doesn't say there's only one story. It assumes that there are many stories, and that we don't even know what they are yet, and that the storytelling is itself an act which can be changed by the cultural format, by the cultural parameters, and that hard work has to be done to set the cultural parameters, right? To create the conditions for the music, to create the conditions for the art, to create the conditions for the theater, so that the stories can come out in all their particularity and all of their surprisingness, right? And so that work is very humble, because it doesn't say we already know the way people are. And it doesn't say we already know what the story is, right? It says that culture is this kind of ongoing activity, this search for particularity and for surprise. So that's a spirit, which is that animating spirit, which is very different from the familiar ways of thinking about culture and politics. And I wanted to take my few minutes at the beginning here to try to set that up. So thank you.
What's striking also about this book that it's not really just about what they do in Krasnogruda and Sarajevo, but the book takes us to those little known parts of Central Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, the Central Europe of Czyzewski, which is made out from these small but culturally vibrant provincial towns and often multilingual, multi-religious communities on the peripheries of Europe. Right? That's what he calls borderlands. I'm sorry, I just had to. I mean, the particularities everywhere. So it's so difficult to actually make this book vivid when we talk about it like that. But here is Irena. I want to ask Irena Grudzińska-Gross right now, not just an academic, but also a literary critic who knows Krzysztof's work for a very, very long time, and I think as one of the very first supported the center for the Borderland Center, when she was a very generous person at the Ford Foundation. Should I tell say it? I want to say it. I want to celebrate that too. So Irena knows Borderlands and knows Czyzewski, knows the book, and here is Irena.
Thank you. It was very easy to be generous as a person from the Ford Foundation. Very big pocket to put my hand in. It's true that I know Krzysztof and Małgosia and Borderland people for a very, very long time, probably the longest among all of us. To follow up on what Tim Snyder said about what kind of activity it is, I have a question for Krzysztof. Now, what if the porcelain is nowhere to be found? If it is destroyed, as we are seeing right now. Because the work that the foundation was doing, that they were doing, the group of people, the small group of people was doing and kind of set up, was a work that seemed completely utopian. All the time it seemed utopian in two ways. That is, it seemed utopian as impossibility simply of finding money, of organizing. The organization was the group, and the work was always on the border of complete bankruptcy. And it was in crisis most of the time. And it seemed impossible to implement their own plans and ideas. But they were utopian also in another way, in that sense, or they seemed utopian, in that sense that their plan of action was always predicated on some kind of goodwill or interest or some kind of curiosity or sensitivity of people wanting to be together in some way. Yes, this was not only the way of being together for the moment, singing with this third voice, you know, in the background, but for that third voice to appear in a way, I just want to say that this was a practical work too, that was supposed to have some results, wasn't it? Yeah. So the question that I have now, what if this work is just being smashed right now? But before I get your reply, I have a very wonderful duty to read a very short note from the person who is unfortunately absent from here. That is from the editor of the book, Making Fowler. This is my microphone. Yeah. Is it okay?
It's too close to this.
You can maybe turn that on.
No, it's not this.
It's me? It's not loud?
Actually, if you could just move a little bit to your right, yeah, because.
Closer to Krzysztof.
Oh, I see. I'm too close to the.
Yeah.
We turn that on.
Okay. So it turns off. My microphone turns off.
It's good. It's not.
It's
Go
good.
ahead, read it.
The other is
Yeah.
the other one is on.
Okay, all right. But mine is turning off and going into this. You know, it is.
No.
It's disconnected, you're in.
It
It's
is?
disconnected. It's
Okay.
fine.
You're fine.
So the person who really made this book exist truly, who worked on it, who was the editor and kind of did it with love. And unfortunately, she is teaching. This is the end of her semester. She couldn't be here, and I have a little declaration that she sent, and I would love to read it. It's just a page and a half. She says that it is the last week of classes at my university, and there's no way I can get away, even for such an important event as to celebrate this book. I've spent a long time with these essays. I edited earlier versions of some of them years ago. I worked on an earlier version of Reinventing Central Europe at a cafe in Lviv, and on an earlier version of the Tishner section of Xenopolis at a bar in Bishkek. Irena approached me in 2018, this is me, to see if I could put together this volume, and I have been living with multiple drafts of these essays since then, in English and in Polish. I've been very hurried working on this book. If I'm honest, I often felt frustrated that I was spending more time on this than, in quotation mark, my own work. And honestly, how many times can you reread Mircea Eliade's memoirs? But I realized when this book came out that it had changed me. Perhaps I had made it my own, or had found myself and what I study in its pages. I study Ukraine. I write on theater, and on a theater that was one of the best in the world, but only Ukrainians and Ukrainianists know about it now because of empire, because of the ways empires tend to crush memory and people and knowledge. It's the Belarus theater. Anyways, I was trained as a Russianist who happened to work on Ukraine. But between 2018 and 2022, I began to see the study of Ukraine as sui generis, and began to see myself as more of an Eastern Europeanist. The sheer fact of the war, of watching its effects on Ukraine, and the way Ukraine changed, and of watching my own struggles at de-imperializing the study of Soviet culture made me more interested in turning away from Moscow. I began to be interested in the childhood of the artists I studied, the lost Polish sisters never discussed, the texture of East European theatrical culture. I started to teach Eastern Europe and realized how much of a survey course on Eastern Europe is about Russian aggression. And all the while, I was editing this book, and on Miłosz, all the while as I was editing this book, on Miłosz and connective tissue, and how we remember trauma and violence. Following up so many of Czyzewski's cast of characters for these essays encouraged me to actually teach a course on Eastern European literature and politics. I'll teach it next year, and I'm assigning this book. I don't know if editing this book caused a geographic and epistemological shift in my understanding of this region, but I certainly facilitated it. After February 24th and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Czyzewski's essay on Bosnia became more painfully relevant, with colleagues, friends, and experts focusing on geopolitics and not on people. The Russians have destroyed connective tissue. Should it be rebuilt? Should it not? Who will the namers be? How do we protect Xenopolis? How do we protect Xenopolis when it seems that empires, based themselves on difference, often want to destroy the cities of others? I would love to hear Krzysztof's responses to these questions and thank him for this book. So thank you, Michiel. And Krzysztof, two questions.
So, but maybe we will go to Jeff before that. I only wanted to let you know, since you don't yet know the book, that the chapter that was referred to, Our Bosnia, is a title, Our Bosnia, Bosnia becomes ours until it hurts. And I think that the question which was asked here, and that you can collect those questions, Krzysztof, is really, I think we all feel as we are here, we could kind of join you in that and say, our Ukraine becomes ours until it hurts. Jeffrey, go for it.
Okay, I didn't prepare a speech today. I read the book, took some notes, and just want to express my deep admiration for the man who wrote these words, and also my sense that this book is impossible, because I think already those of you who don't know of Krzysztof's work before this event are getting a sense of it. But as Tim pointed out, it's all in the particularity. It's all about the concreteness. So I have nothing general to say about the book other than to applaud it. But I do kind of I think that maybe what I should do is actually read the chapter titles, because what Krzysztof has done, and by the way, I went to Sejny before Miłosz's house was renovated, so a long time ago. I know of Krzysztof because of the theater movement that he was part of, and that actually led to Elżbieta and me meeting so many years ago. And I have a sense that there's and the sensibility that's behind the work. As Tim was speaking, I wanted to say Alicja Vanska. So who's Alicja Vanska? She's my sociology, anthropology teacher when I was an undergraduate, who gave me the possibility of helping her with some research on theater in New York, comparing alternative theater in New York, Montreal, and Mexico City. And she was exactly the kind of person that Tim just described. And what I see in that is a miracle. It's a miracle. My first book was entitled The Persistence of Freedom, and there's and I'm not sure that title is a good title, but there's a persistence of a sensibility that provides an alternative between the stark, clear path of economic determinism, neoliberalism and Marxism, and nationalism. And the way it's cultivated, and what makes this book an impossible book, is that the alternative is in the particulars. So what really Krzysztof, admirably tries to summarize his position, but it's very difficult to summarize the position. So he writes about first chapter, Miłosz, the connective tissue, and he does kind of careful reflection of what is meant by connective tissue, and observes miraculously that this is what how Miłosz named what they're doing, kind of connecting people who are different with mutual respect. But the words I just spoke feel to me like jargon, because really you get to know it when Krzysztof writes about Miłosz, or when we listen to Miłosz. He discusses deep culture. Again, it's I have to say that the concepts, this is in the first section of the book, which is called Concepts. And as far as I'm concerned, no offense, this is the least successful section of the book, because much more, so he writes about connective tissue, deep culture, and the dreams of the Polish outsider. That I really, really liked, I have to say. But then what becomes really exciting is when he writes about places and people. And it's not exactly what he said about, it's not, each chapter is an attempt to express a sensibility through an encounter with a place or a person. And so he then somehow miraculously reproduces what he does in practice in saying it. So writing about this, giving it a summary like a liberal account, or an idea of constitutional versus ethnic patriotism, and trying to get something in between. The general account doesn't work, but the specific encounter with people and with places actually is tremendously illuminating, and that's what he does not only when he encounters such people as Eliade, Vysotsky, Baranchak, and so forth. These are brilliant essays, but it's also what happens when he works with the children of Sejny. So I'm a New York Jew. There's not, Sejny and New York City in some ways are exact opposites. A small village town on the very peripheries of a country, lost, unknown until this Polish. Am I exaggerating?
No. I think I don't know what you want to.
No. But the Senkach is better than saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the thing is that they have become the same. The sense, I had a sense, though I went so far away, that I was actually returning home. And returning home in the sense that when I first went to Poland, I had a friend who told me, there's something you're going to miss about being an American. I was an American new leftist, 68er, and no, I'm really looking for adventure. I'm not going to be nostalgic. After 1 week, I realized it seemed to me that everyone was the same. And I felt very, very uncomfortable being in a place where everyone was the same. And when I went to Sena, I didn't have that feeling. That this cosmopolitan, the cosmopolitan and the provincial had come together, and it's in all the concrete practices that they do, that this alternative to the horrors of the 20th century and now the horrors of the 21st century are actually constituted. And what's miraculous about the book is that it's very, very difficult to name this alternative, and every attempt that Krzysztof makes to give a definitive naming of the alternative, I think, is bound to fail. But the sensibility that he brings to his writing, that appear in this volume, and in his practices, are actually glorious successes. So I really recommend you're reading this book, because it's, if you don't have a chance to actually go to Sena and meet the people of the Borderland Foundation. So that's my response. A little bit of criticism, but a great deal of appreciation for a really wonderful book and a wonderful life.
I'm not sure whether Krzysztof is ready to answer. I wanted only maybe before you come here, and I absolutely disagree with Jeff about those concepts, because those are not concepts. Those are, they're concepts. They are different ways of naming things that otherwise we would never see if we would not have those names. And those are the concepts. The whole idea of connective tissue, which you know what it is. It's just this little spongy thing between the skin and the muscles, right? This is where the water goes. If you don't have waters, this is where the stress is. When the stress is, this is when you, it is so important in order to be alive, to know it, and to be able to translate that into this vital thing that we need in order to live. It's actually, I think, for us, incredibly important. She did write it in this letter, this beautiful letter, that the connective tissue at the moment, as we are here right now, is shattered. And and this is where we are, and we don't think of, and I kind of know how to think about it because of the book. So here it is. Okay, I wanted to ask before Krzysztof comes here. There is this, because maybe this is really the moment to see how this book can serve us. Not only because it is about Bosnia and Kosovo and other wars. It is not because of how to bridge differences and create something much more fluid that is give and take, but also because it is the answer that you found. So in the very last sentence of Tim's introduction, which starts with Miłosz and kind of in a certain way ends with Miłosz. When he says, so first of all, sir, I miss the porcelain. That's the first sentence. The very last sentence, the borderlands found the porcelain. So what went wrong? Why is it that, perhaps things are changing? Why is it that we here in the United States, but also we here in Poland, and quite recently, and others in other places, did not find our porcelain? Krzysztof.
Should I turn it off?
That's okay.
Yeah.
Actually, this is all on.
Okay, that's okay.
This doesn't work, does it?
Thank you very much for all your questions, interventions, and I'm in a not easy position. I know, especially that we have the war in Ukraine with us, and it's extremely difficult to talk now about collective tissue, about building bridges, about coexistence and so on. But here are my answers to that question. Irena was saying about utopian project we launched in 1989. And yes, it's true, we were always in crisis, on the edge of impossibility. That's how we establish our work and practice, on the edge of impossibility. And among the people with traumatic memories, broken bridges. So the first gesture, I would say, was to try to go toward Xenopolis, not in solitude, somewhere like 68ers would do it, and I was among them also. You know, my belief at that time was, as an avant-garde artist, that you should look for your community outside of society, somewhere in the forest, somewhere far away, because only this is the way to practice your dreams. What we did in 1989, and it was a lesson of 1989, was to go out of the underground, to go out of alternative, to the people, to the small town, to the community. So our work was about all these Xenopolis and all these ideas among the people of the Borderland small region. And it was not only among, but the whole concept, the whole idea was hanging on the people's will and engagement. Because we didn't create a studio of artists in a small town to make rehearsals and to prepare our performance, for example. We established our work that it could be only possible if people were engaged in it. Only. Yeah, so it was a completely different concept of culture activities. That's what the beginning of the deep culture concept is, you know, and when you hear deep culture, again, you feel like our first encounters with journalists, with media at the time. You are doing such ambitious things. It is not for the people. Yeah, the connection of going deep, going ambitious. People consider like something what is not for the people, that you should do it among elitist circles. But we decided to do it with a local community, small town society. The most ambitious things, the most courageous things, the most critical, with them, not at the academy, not on the festivals, but with them. We publish books like Neighbors by Jan Gross, there in a small town, about the environment, which is a little bit different to publish it in a big city and academy. And we launched the discussions, of course, about that with that people and so on. So why it was so? Because from that time when I was working in alternative culture, as we call it, you know, the problem is that because we were cut off of the so-called normal social life, community life, it was so easy to go astray in the long distance. because you didn't confront it, you know, with the reality of people's life. Yeah, so the decision was to go to the people and do, and all, you know, and do everything together and check how it works. You couldn't lie amongst these people. No, you couldn't idealize. You couldn't make any ideology. Yeah, because it's always confronted with the ground of the borderland life. Yeah, so it was like a permanent examination. For example, to give you another example, we were NGO, the foundation at the beginning, but when only we came to Sejny, to small town, we established a regional center supported by regional government. And our friends were saying, why you are doing that? You will never be independent. You should keep to be NGO because it gives you independence. But we didn't want to be independent. We wanted to be interdependent, which is a little bit something else, you know. And because to be interdependent means that you are somehow in hands of the community, yes? You, again, giving up with your rights, with your freedom, but in response, you have a common responsibility for this work. Yeah, and engagement. So that was, and when you asked me about the porcelain, and we discovered it in the people, in the human beings, in the community, in the real. That all these treasures we found for the work were inside people's memories, experience, human life experience. And of course, to focus, you know, the easiest thing for us at that time was to focus on negative aspects of the life, on conflicts, of traumatic memories, of how they suffered because of the neighbors and so on. Very important things, but somehow the easiest things to dig up. The most difficult was this, what I call good memories, something what was positive, but you don't have a language to talk about that. We have a language to speak about conflicts and negative things and how we suffered from others, but we don't have a legitimate language to talk about what we created in common or what we did in a positive way. Yes, even if it could be some, you know, some crimes, even small things. But our work became from the beginning very much, and this is also the book. You know, the paradoxical situation of my writing is that I'm writing about the wars, I'm writing about painful things, and I always think, but you are so optimistic, you are so idealist, you know. I'm working with people, with Holocaust survivors, you know, with people experiencing broken bridges, and they are all the time in my narrative. But only one thing is different, maybe, that I don't stop on the negative aspects, because I'm pushed by them. I'm pushed by my mentors, like Miłosz, like Irena Weissaiter, like other borderlanders. You know, we have this award we are offering to the, like Jerzy Ficowski, you know, Bogdan Osarczuk from Ukraine, Thomas Menclowa, who went through the hell of 20th century. And they don't want us to stay in the darkness. You know, the challenge for us is to find the way out, legitimate way, to find legitimate language for today. But I think you can imagine this tricky position of the people experiencing very negative, times and emotions and conflicts and wars. For example, Poles and Lithuanians living in my town. That's what I very often experience. That they have some good will, even intention to make a good gesture toward her or his neighbors and so on. But how I can do it? We don't have rituals for that. We have rituals to commemorate our own suffering and all what Tim said about our stories, which is more or less important. We have our cultural houses, media, church, everything is concentrated on our separate stories. And the language is also like that. We celebrate over the year, all these holidays which celebrate our Polish, Lithuanian or other things. But we don't have rooms, time, language to celebrate something in common. And something, to give the voice to this willingness of making good to others we are living with. So that was the role for us. We see this community help us in that. And of course, to make it, you should be legitimate. You should have your credibility. So you should have courage to touch the wounds, of course, and to know all of that. But at the same time, to find the cover of the book
I wanted to show it.
is made by Wiesław Szumiński, our team member, painter, but these paintings comes from something what we call Mystery of the Bridge, which is, I may say, our Borderland ritual since 7-8 years, that we have a special day in our calendar, the Day of the Bridge. This is a holiday of the bridge. And you may say nobody possesses this day. This is either Polish or Lithuanian, Catholic or Orthodox or Protestants. It's a bridge day. And and each year we creating kind of performance on building a bridge, a story which expressing this work on the common bridge together with local people and our guests from other sides, corners of the world. But never something like a mystery of the bridge existed in the community. Sometimes it's a challenge or the call to create something completely new, which just help people to express these emotions, the feelings they have, and they can do it in this mystery of the bridge as well as other things. So when you to summarize that, when you ask me about porcelain, about these lessons of today, of what's going in the world, it's still that ground, that it's so easy to destroy the bridge overnight. You can do it, like we experience now. But sooner or later, the work of rebuilding the bridge will come to our life. Yes, because there is no way. That's what I experience in this work. That we, as Elżbieta said, we can't live with connective tissue. And the same is with the bridge. My question from the Bosnian War, I remember our friend Kostek Gebert, with whom I traveled there, and we were working with Tadeusz Mazowiecki, who was representative of international community for the war in former Yugoslavia at that time, and Kostek was asking me all the time, what you are saying about these bridges, you know, look around, they are all fired up. And what is the sense of that? You know, maybe it's better to focus or to establish your life on your one bank of the river, you know, to build your life rather as a fortress than the bridge. And even there are some parts of this book, when I'm saying, for example, about Kosovo, there is a long essay here, when I'm saying that it was necessary and I was supporting the division between Serbs and Albanians at that time. I was against insisting them, especially during the wartime, to live together or to have a dialogue and so on. As today we have this insistence on Ukrainians to talk with Russians, to have dialogues and so on. No way.
Forced inclusion.
Yes,
right?
forced inclusion. That's not about this kind of work. Sometimes you should realize that the part of building bridges is to be separated and establish yourself on the bank, you know, on the one side, feeling at home. But it's never for a long time. The natural milieu for the human being is not a fortress. That's about ourselves. Something is inside us to cross. Something about our human being is to cross to the other side. And sooner and later it will happen. And you can only build it as good as it possible, because we will not live on one side of the river, never. And you develop this craft, you know, this workshop to just help to make it. And for a certain period of time, it could be, you know how the bridge is built, because that is a misunderstanding very much about the bridges, because we think that it is so utopian, idealistic picture of the bridge. But when you start to build a bridge, you do it like a fortress. You know, you have a span. You have to have a good span on the bank. It's not about hanging in the air. Yeah, there should be span rooted on, you know, firmly stated on the bank. Without that, there's no bridge. I remember my friend Serhii Żadan, the Ukrainian poet and intellectualist. When I visited him in Kharkiv, we had a seminar, Heresy of Borderland. And the way we spoke together with him about the borderland, at that time, it was more than 10 years ago, that the whole willingness of Serhii was to build a span, to be Ukrainian. Yes, at that borderland, to have this opportunity to express himself as he wants. It was not very much about the dialogue and bridging with Russia and so on. Now he was at that time, he was already ready to fight. And he was aware that he should be fighter for the future, because it will cost to have this span. It will cost for his living there. But so this is about the bridge also. You shouldn't negate that, you know, and because otherwise, imagining the bridge as something hanging in the air is a very illusionary image about the bridge, in fact. So now, even in such terrible circumstances with the war, you have Ukrainian people, Ukrainian nation fighting for the span. To have span, you know, firmly stated which will make them, giving their voice and be, at your themselves. Yeah? That's what they had to find, since long time. But I see it as a part of building a bridge. Not as, eternal separation of something.
So we kind of are running out of time, but this is what I would propose, that we'll ask our guests whether they want very briefly to comment on each other or on whatever they want, but I like to think that what Krzysztof brought back, the situation which we are also very much engaged in, whether we are here or in Poland or in Ukraine, that somewhat through this book I see it clearer, but I'd like you to maybe comment on it and then we will take questions, short questions. I'm looking at Jeff, but that's not that I asked you
Because I
to
did
talk.
raise my hand.
Okay,
But I don't want to kind of make it impossible to speak. I just would want to point out that your last statement involves great difficulty. Because on the one hand, you want to kind of firmly, Ukrainians need right now to kind of firmly ground their position. The danger, of course, is that they don't take, some time in the future that a second step isn't taken. And over again, I'm listening to Elena, I have a sense that, we're in this situation yet again. There's a sense that this wasn't supposed to, we were past this. And how do we stop from this endless cycle, which is so dramatically and tragically being revealed right now? And it really is the moment, the time, it was unexpected. And maybe Tim expected, he knows the story better than I do, but there's a kind of repetition to this, and I think your project is a valued project to stop the repetition, and I think that it has to happen. The world is a much better place because borderlanders do their work, but it's a hard time.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk to the mic, please? Yeah.
Agreeing with you, Jeff, I wanted to pick up the theme of the war in Ukraine because I had the impression we were talking about that, and I have some questions are going to be asked about it. Because it strikes me, Jeff, that there's something quite borderlandish about the way that Ukraine is actually fighting this war. So it's not usual when you're fighting a war to have the same language as your attacker. That's not typical, right? But the Ukrainian soldiers' default language in combat is in fact Russian. They are using Ukrainian to find infiltrators and spies, and of course in their public appearances, they use Ukrainian. But their default language, their language of war, is in fact Russian. It's not usual to have a president who is bilingual and code switches, but that reflects the way that Ukrainians in fact live all the time. They're code switching all the time between Ukrainian and Russian, or a more or less elegant mix of the two. And I think there's a way in which what we're seeing is, a kind of typical Ukrainian muddle that's now been elevated to a place where we can see it in the form of the president and this war that he's leading. But I have to say, I find something very encouraging about the fact that they're winning. Because, who expected it like this? The plot, I wasn't that surprised that the war started, and I'm not that surprised the Ukrainians are doing well, but there's a reason why everyone expected they do poorly, which is that we all think, well, of course, the centralized, homogenizing empire is going to be an irresistible force, as opposed to these people. They don't even know what language they speak, and aren't there a bunch of oligarchs, and who are they really? And I heard there were some nationalists, like these people whose story we can't even get our minds around. How can they possibly be winning? Nobody except them, I think it's fair to say, with a few exceptions. Nobody except them thought that they could win this war, but they all think they could win this war. They all think they can win this war. And I find something encouraging about that the country that no one had ever heard of, that everybody regarded as just a meaningless province, which has more than one language, which has a president who belongs to a traditionally oppressed ethnic minority, that has a Jewish president, that this country is actually not just the winning part, but that it's holding together during this war. And that's connected because the way that they're fighting this war is very different from the way that Russia is fighting this war. Russia is fighting this war in the traditional vertical way in which people are following orders that they receive or not. Whereas the reason why the Ukrainians are still in it is that they're fighting it in a decentralized way on the basis of local communities who identify themselves with the soldiers. And that doesn't come out of nowhere, right? You can't give an order. The president can't stand up and say, I order everyone to support this war in every way that you can think of, right? And that's the other thing, is the creativity. Like not just the president, but the way the entire culture has reacted to this war. I mean, even in expressing the horror of it has been quite creative. Like their efforts to reach us have been quite creative. Their efforts to reach Poles have been quite creative. Their efforts to tell their stories have been quite creative. The ways that they're gathering evidence on war crimes, unprecedented. So I guess I want to say is that I think this war is not. I'm responding a little bit to Jeff. I think this war is not just a rebuff to this vision. Right? I think that even in, or maybe even especially in wartime, some of these virtues of ambiguity and the way that identity can be created around ambiguity rather than around certainty, that can actually even function during war, and that's the encouraging thing to be observed here.
I wanted to, I agree absolutely with everything that Timothy Snyder said, but I wanted to ask if this is not typical of, not atypical, but typical of an anti-colonial war in which the colonized people speak the language of people they are fighting against, and that this is a situation in which you cannot abandon the culture of the oppressor because you have absorbed it in such a way that it is part of your culture. This is something that is in a way very creative. And in fact, I was, as usual, when I talk to Krzysztof may be the judge of it, I'm always, in a way, opposing the kind of idealism that is behind the work that he does and that his crew, his family does. But I always do it so that he convinces me. And I'm always coming back back to the same thing. Isn't it true? Yeah. I just realized it. Because this happened, I don't know, the 10th time, maybe the 20th time, that I'm always somehow trying to say, but actually what you are doing is utopian.
But then you get your porcelain.
But then I get my porcelain, yes, thank you.
Well, we have very little time if you want to have a little bit more conversation downstairs. If you have questions, direct to actually anybody. Please go.
Thank you.
I would like to ask you about comments on Polish-Ukrainian relationship and how it changed with time. because I believe everybody's surprised about wonderful nation, Poles, and Ukrainians present.
And the question is to Professor Snyder
Yes.
or to anyone?
You're naming something which, interestingly, as you know, no one in America pays any attention to. So, in America, there are these reports, oh, the Poles have taken 1 million, 2 million, 3 million Ukrainians, in addition to the million or so who are already there, right? But nobody in America realizes that there's anything complicated about that. Right? I find this very striking. So you and I can have this conversation, we know what we're talking about, but in America, people look at it and they just say, well, you know, it's just a bunch of white people and they're all Christians, so how could there be a problem, right?
And they get money from the West.
But I mean, as we know very well, I mean, the interwar Poland, the Ukrainian question was actually in most ways more problematic than the Polish question. The Polish government was much more worried about Ukrainian political activity than it was about Jewish political activity, or for that matter, Belarusian or German. And from the Ukrainian side, it was painful that people who were used to going to school in Ukrainian in the Habsburg monarchy suddenly couldn't go to school in Ukrainian in Poland. It was painful for the Greek Orthodox Church that enjoyed fewer rights in interwar Poland than it had in the Habsburg monarchy. And then when Ukrainian nationalists carried out assassinations they always, this is very much reveals the importance of Krzysztof's work, because when the nationalists killed people, they always killed the people who were trying to build connective tissue, precisely. And then the Polish state reacted by these mass retributions against Ukrainians. That was very painful for Ukrainians. But of course, you know, I'm sure what you're thinking of is the wartime ethnic cleansing, which no one. Oh, and then, you know, in Volhynia, which is so. There was this interesting character called Krzysztof Czyzewski, who was a Pole who actually did in Volhynia in the interwar period a little bit the kind of thing that Krzysztof was trying to do in Sejny. That is, he really believed in the encounter with Ukrainians quite sincerely, and he worked on it. It was within a geopolitical situation where it turned out to be impossible. But even there, by 1939, Poland had closed the last Orthodox church, I think in August of 1939, so right before the war started, so not exactly good timing. And then, you know, I'm sure you're thinking of the ethnic cleansing by the UPA of Poles in Volhynia, which followed tens of thousands of Poles killed, for which the Poles actually then responded, I mean, as everyone should know, in various guises, as German policemen, in the Soviet partisans, in the AK. There was a fair amount of killing of Ukrainian civilians as well. And then the mutual ethnic cleansing, or the bi-directional ethnic cleansing that the Soviets carried out after the war, where Poles were sent one way and Ukrainians were sent another way, ending with Operation Vistula, which was already mentioned in the introduction, where the Lemkos and others were resettled. It's an extraordinary history of mutual recrimination and suffering. And in Reconstruction of Nations, which Elżbieta was kind enough to mention, I write about how in the 1990s there was a conscious effort on the Polish side, and for me this is one of the most intelligent moments in like recent foreign policy history. There was a very intelligent move on the part of people like Kademek and Mazowiecki and Skubiszewski to say, we recognize that there are these conflicts, but we're going to nevertheless accept Ukrainian statehood, right? And that's a kind of bridge building exercise. Like they said, okay, we're going to accept that there's Ukraine and that these are its borders, and there's something sad, of course, about Lviv. You know, there's something sad about it, but we're going to accept these borders, which they did even before the Soviet Union fell apart. And for me, like, that is a critical moment, like that moment of Polish recognition of Ukraine, which comes out of one of the figures who flips through this book, which is Jerzy Giedroyc, right? Like, that's his wisdom. His wisdom was always in immigration in Paris, or in Maison Lafitte. His vision was always, we have to recognize that those Belarusians and the Lithuanians and those Ukrainians are people and like it's not just in its own interest to do so, but it's also true. And so we had this magical thing where the journal is called Kultura, but it's about politics, and the Kultura is the politics. Like we recognize these people because we understand those states have to exist in the future, right? For us to be our best selves, and for the Russians to be their best selves, Ukraine, the Russian, Lithuania have to exist. So that was a golden moment, which and there have been difficult things since the 1990s, but without that golden moment, everything would be very different. Because of the wisdom of the Polish Eastern policy at that time, basically from the 1990s forwards, the Ukrainians have been in this position where they've never been before, which is they only have one empire, right? And this is a familiar position for Poles too, the era of the partitions, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, having more than one empire, right? That's the historical Ukrainian position as well, and you just, with a little reminder that sometimes Poland was the empire, like in the 17th century, the 16th century. And so one good thing which happened in the 20th century is that thanks largely to Polish initiative, the Ukrainians now only have to face one empire, which they are facing. I mean, they're in this very difficult position, but it's only one empire now. But as for why it's going so well now, I mean, that's more of a question to Poles. I mean, I can only say that as I have observed it, I'm going to say an optimistic thing now, if Adena will permit me. I mean, as I have observed it, I mean, first of all, the Polish government, although the Polish government is not responsible for sheltering these 3 million Ukrainians, the Polish government did things which I wouldn't have expected to do, like say you don't have to have papers, you can just come. And then you have this extraordinary action of civil society, which is micro level on a macro scale, where basically everyone I know in Poland has Ukrainian in their house, and then many of the people I know in Poland are carrying out these activities, which if you say, well, can I help you, can I give you money? You can't give them money because it's like 3 people, you know, and that's reproduced on a scale of thousands and thousands of thousands. And so what I'd like to hope is that this activity, because another thing is that many people who I know who are doing this, their grandfather or their great uncle or their great grandfather was murdered in Volhynia in 1943. And it's not as though people forget that, right? I think it's more that it's, you know, there's this great phrase, it's patochka, the solidarity of the shaken, right? That you can identify with some terrible thing which has happened to someone else because you've been in a similar position. And that identification can overcome the feeling that they did something to you and you did something to them. That's what Patochka, this philosopher, teacher, followed. The solidarity of the shaken. I think from what I hear from my Polish friends, there's something like that. That we have been in a position which is not so different from this. And then what I'd like to hope is that this activity, you know, this hospitality culture, because that's another thing which Americans don't understand is the hospitality culture, that you could just actually have people in your house for a very long time, and you might have this just in Israel, right? We don't really do that sort of thing. Right? Come for a night, help me with the dishes, see you later. But like Polish hospitality culture, I mean, it seems a very simple thing, but it's not a simple thing at all. Like hospitality is a very deep, profound idea. So what I'd like to hope is that these encounters are then like this at this moment, you know, may it not go sour. Like may this moment of 2022 then be the thing that Poles and Ukrainians look back on and say, oh, we did this thing together. And in Ukraine, the thing is, the Ukrainians are now going back, right? So there's a trajectory, like more Ukrainians are going back to Ukraine now every day than are arriving in Poland. The numbers are actually moving in that way. So this could be, I mean, again, I'm like being way too optimistic here, Jeff, but it could be that this is part of a story of rebuilding Ukraine, right? That like when these Ukrainians look back on this moment, they'll say, I went to Poland, I was there for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. People helped me, and then I went back, right? And then that becomes the memory. And then maybe 3 generations down the line, people will remember that, you know, instead of the things that they remember now. So I can't fully explain, you know, I'm just describing a little bit, but I appreciate the question because it's very important.
I actually think that this is a very good moment to end, and I'd like to thank you. And I should give Krzysztof last word. Do you want to have last word? Before I say that that's the end. Yeah, go ahead.
One word, because this book is very much about the culture, although it touches such things as ethnic conflicts, wars, and so on. And it comes out from my experience of the war, the war I'm exploring here is Bosnian or former Yugoslavia, war in the former Yugoslavia. And you know, beside the dark side of the war and experience, that the hatredness is born, and my Ukrainian friends today writes me in the letters that only now they know what hate is and how it comes into their houses and to their life. There is another thing in the war which I call Karuna's blow. Karuna is from Sanskrit, this goddess of compassion, and but the very special compassion, not about your own suffering or even the suffering of your own people, but the awakeness of self, the presence of suffering of the others. And when you experience that, you have completely different view to the world. I mean, something what was easy for you to divide or separate, like for example, the autonomy of culture from your moral position. I think it's a very dangerous borderline we created in our Western culture. We separated beauty from good. And we tend to explain the problems with culture, that this is an autonomous thing. You know, I remember my first feeling, you know, when I was in the siege Sarajevo and I came to Warsaw back. And in a liberal newspaper in Warsaw, I read an article about a Russian writer, Limonov. You know, it's a writer, and the story was like about the controversial writer of Limonov. We know that he is tending to support nationalism of Milosevic at the same time as Russian chauvinism and so on, but he wrote a very interesting book like masterpiece, by the way, about New York. And when I read this article, I discovered that I am not anymore belong to this culture. I couldn't stay it and accept, which was possible for me before. So it was a radical change in my life, that you can't divide these two things. But I was very alone in Warsaw, in Poland at that time. But now when war came closer, because it's war with Ukraine, I see this change among people in Poland. So they wouldn't accept it anymore. So to give you an example, I wrote a strong protest against Peter Handke when he received Nobel Prize. And it was exactly from my Yugoslav Bosnian experience.
There was a playwright who supported Milosevic.
Yes.
Very much, very strongly.
And people from young generation, young Polish writers, started to write me letters saying sorry. And it was not even before because of Ukrainian war, but because of the Polish-Belarusian border. You know, there were activists on the border with Belarus. It is another problem we face till today. So we are not so hospitable for immigrants coming from across Belarusian border, from Syria, Africa, and so on. So there are different immigrants, in fact. But only when she experienced the work on the border with Belarus, she started to understand that There's no way to accept the writer who will negate mass
Atrocities, yeah.
yes, mass murder like in Srebrenica, like Handke did, yeah, for example. So I'm giving you this example as something what I consider revolutionary also for our future. Because what's going on in Ukraine, my hope again, is that maybe we can rethink this this way we understand culture today, in fact, and how it happened that we designed so that we created this borderline between beauty and good. So this is not only the question about Russian culture today, should we accept it or not, but this is a question about our culture, how we understand it. Yeah, in fact. And this not acceptance of the artists collaborating in that or another way with Putin and Putinism is something what gives us the opportunity to think about much more general things that Ukrainian-Russian relationships for the future. And this is also about Xenopolis, very much. If we are heading to Xenopolis in the future, this way how we will understand culture will be crucial as well. Thank you very much.